have, that is the moment the scene goes from boring to bad. I always picture Kate Middleton when I read that. I don't even know whose coat rack this is. Okay, I should probably talk about writing now. Hey there, I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and story nerd, and today I am going to be critiquing the first page of the first draft of my own novel, and then I am going to be talking you through how I went from first draft to second draft and critiquing the first page of the second draft of my novel. If you didn't see part 1, it's the 5 questions that I asked myself, or I did ask myself when I went from part 1 to part 2. I'm going to be referencing that throughout this video, so if you haven't seen it, definitely go check it out. You can check it out before or after, it doesn't really matter. This is from the first draft of my novel that I summarized in a video called My Novel Was a Disaster. I ended up very much changing the story from the first draft to the second draft, and I fixed specifically kind of like the scene setup and the build up, which I think can be applicable to anybody. Not that I'm trying to like teach or anything like that. I just hope that by sharing my experience, you might get some ideas or some enjoyment out of it. So here we go. It's a first draft and a second draft, and so I haven't gone through and line edited and made everything pretty and perfect yet. Because it's a draft and it has changed. And if you would like to follow along, I have the versions as well as comments on them on my website. You can find it at the link below and download a PDF with these different versions. No one could remember the name of the city. Aggie's father stubbornly refused to call it anything but York because God forbid his life be altered by anything William Lyon Mackenzie ordered. Aggie's mother flitted between calling it York and Toronto, depending on how tired she was and whether their father was within earshot. Only Greer went about proclaiming their city Toronto with confident pride. With the advent of the new year, everything was worse. When Aggie went to pen a letter to her cousin Maud in Kingston, she wrote 1836 instead of 1837 and York instead of Toronto, and the page turned into a mess of ink blots and scratches. So, that was my original opening. I don't think it's particularly bad writing. There are actually things that I think work and that I quite like. I was thinking in the style of 1984 a little bit. The opening line of that is the clocks were striking 13, or at least that's part of the opening line. And it's kind of a, this is the setting and things are slightly off kind of way. No one can remember the name of the city. I do think there are a few problems with this though. I introduced 6 characters in the first paragraph, which is a lot of characters. And one of my rules is to try to not overwhelm the readers with tons of proper nouns. So not only do I have like a few proper nouns, I'm also talking about York versus Toronto and 1836 versus 1837. And it's just a little more sweeping than I'm going for. But ultimately, after having written the whole book, what I introduce here isn't that important. And that was the biggest reason that I decided to edit it out. So then we start with the dialogue. Father glanced up from his newspaper. And what dress is this? Did you not just have a new one? Blah, blah, blah. This dialogue I just think is too freaking boring for a first scene. It's not that they're talking about dresses and balls, it's that we're 400 words in and the conflict really isn't clear, or at the very least it's not compelling. We have a young girl who wants a new dress and no one else seems very interested in it. So I just felt like that wasn't very engaging. If we keep going, it's like, okay, I mean, we're pouring tea. Great. Well, then, go on with it, Agatha. Father shrugged and disappeared behind his newspaper. All right. That line of conflict, does she get a new dress or not, is now gone. Apparently, nobody cares. So that's not a very interesting way to start a story. Moving on. Mother received her cup. I'm assuming here that Branna has given her a cup. I don't know where that happened. She was giving a cup to... Oh, she put the cups down on the table. And then I guess she started passing them out. I never actually wrote that that happened. Anyways, Mother received her cup with a thoughtful expression on her face. Greer, I do think you might consider having a new dress made as well. And then Greer says, I'm not going to the ball. And now she also has a cup of coffee. So we get some conflict, a little bit. Greer doesn't want to go to the ball. We have some characterization happening. We think. We keep going. Nothing really happens. Greer's head snapped up and she shot Aggie a look that made Aggie's heart drop. There was no friendliness or sisterly care in her gaze. It was as if Aggie were a bug crawling under Greer's skirt and the only way to deal with her was to squish her. And then Greer says, "You know I do not like to dance." Okay, so we have some sisterly animosity, and then Aggie is like, "This is a lie. As little girls, they spent hours dancing about their bedroom, dancing in the parlor, dancing outside in the snow." Mother opened her mouth to respond, but then Father cursed, closed his newspaper, and slammed it against the table. Rebel, claptrap, exclamation point. Okay, we have a lot going on. So we just had a paragraph where Aggie was like, "My sister's lying. She actually does like to dance. She has a different reason for not wanting to go to the ball," which is, I mean, that actually ends up being the thing that I pull out later because it's important. But I mean, sure, there's some conflict there. It's like not the most engaging conflict ever. And then that line where Father closes his newspaper and says "rebel claptrap," that is the moment the scene goes from boring to bad. This whole time we've been sort of focusing on these family dynamics, the relationship between the sisters, the ball, where we kind of started getting somewhere interesting with Greer lying about the dancing, and then in the middle of the scene we completely switch focus to something else and abandon that thread. So basically what this does is everything up until now has basically just been filler to be able to have this interruption, and that is very clumsy and kind of intrusive and doesn't flow very well, and we kind of lose that thread of conflict. Let's keep going. Aggie froze, Greer froze, even Branna, still holding the serving tray on Greer's other side, froze. Mother calmly lowered her cup. "Robert, whatever is the matter?" I don't like this scene, but I just really enjoy the mother being like, he's like just this like loud explosion and just being like, "What is the matter? Hello?" Anyways, I always picture Kate Middleton when I read that. All right, then we really get going here. This is some first draft stuff. "That Toronto Patriot staff is a group of dim-witted ninny heads. I intend to find that editor and talk to him right this morning." Dim-witted ninny heads. "What did they do, Father?" Aggie asked. Father's eyes, chaperoned by wrinkles in their corners, flashed behind his spectacles. "They reprinted an editorial that cantankerous and quarrelsome little cad published in his bloody farce of a newspaper." Lots of adjectives. Aggie knew the cad in question was William Mackenzie, former mayor of Toronto and current printer of some sort of reformer newspaper that never ceased to make Father mutter darkly. So the last sentence, I don't mind that much. And the scene went on from here. Father left, and then some rebels threw a rock through the window, which happened conveniently 5 minutes after the newspaper article was introduced and we started talking about reformers. That first scene was just like a mess. Okay, really. So that was the beginning. I actually initially posted this version, which was longer, more like a 3,000 word of the full opening on Scribophile, and I did get feedback, and so to contrast my own critiques of me saying it's horrible, I'm going to give you a brief selection of some of the Scribophile feedback that I got. Everybody hated it. There was some good feedback. Ultimately, though, it doesn't really come down to the quality of the writing, but whether it's serving the overall story in a first or second draft. So, based on those 5 questions that I asked earlier, you can go see that video again in part 1 of this and just see how well I addressed them. So question number 1, choose a strategy for engaging the reader in the first chapter. I didn't really have a strategy for writing this scene. I had a mix of character, I had a mix of sort of setting, and I had a mix of action. You don't see this in the 700 words that I shared, but about 100 words after the end of that, a rock flies through the window. And then what was the main emotion I was trying to create? I didn't really have a purpose. I feel like I was just trying to establish rather than trying to create emotions or questions deliberately. I think that's the biggest problem, is that I wasn't focused enough. How quickly are characters and setting being introduced? I feel like they were introduced fairly quickly. We got a lot of names and setting pieces pretty fast and a little bit of exposition. It was maybe a bit too much, but I think it was okay. It wasn't too bad. Is the scene clearly going somewhere? Is there a clear conflict, escalation, resolution? That scene that I just shared, there is conflict, escalation, resolution. However, it's a little bit all over the place. There's not one through line. It's more like we have this kind of conflict about the family's like happy upper class lives, and then we have a very upset father, and then there's a rock, and there's a lot of conflict about what happens after this rock comes through the window. So rather than it being this one thing that's rising and falling, we rise, but it's like we have this line of conflict, and then we have this line of conflict, and then we have the next line of conflict. And it's like getting more and more conflicting, but it's not the same thing. It's not the same line. All of these things are part of the story and continue to be part of the story, but the focus is, I feel like the focus of that scene was kind of off. Is this scene a mirror or reflection of the final scene? Is something that is set up here paid off later? That was a first draft. The answer to that question is no. And how are you ending to launch the readers forward? That's a good question. How did I end that scene? The final words of the scene was after the rock came through, Greer told everyone that, hey, it was probably just a prank, whatever. And so Branna says, it wasn't a prank. It wasn't little boys who threw the rock, was it? And Greer reached onto the dining room table and picked up the newspaper Mother had abandoned there in her haste. No, Branna, she said, it wasn't. So it ends fairly well. There's a bit of a, okay, it wasn't actually a prank. There's something going on here. It's a bit of a setting up new question, a little bit of intrigue. But we weren't building towards that from the beginning of the scene. At the beginning of the scene, we were talking about going to a ball. And while you can have crazy things kind of come up and interrupt and go in a way that you don't expect it to go, I just don't love the way that I did it. I feel like openings are a lot better when you can kind of see, it's not that you know where it's going, but it's that when you get to the end, you can see the beginning. The end of that scene with the rock flying through the window or whatever, and them being like, ooh, there's something going on, is like hardly connected at all to the beginning. So I then wrote the rest of this novel, and then I sat back down, and if you want to hear, I basically decided that this whole first draft was a disaster, and you can see the video about that up there. But I really kind of changed how the story was being framed, or rather I changed the characters' motivations and a little bit of the focus. So I decided to focus on character and a sort of information style plot as my strategy for the first scene. Is this a perfect opening, what I'm about to share with you? No, it's a second draft. I already have a version that I think is better, but I thought it would be fun to go through it. So, version 2. For hours, Agatha Kent sat on a settee in the parlor. Her embroidery lay on her lap, but she didn't make so much as one stitch. Even as a little girl, she had been praised for her ability to sit still, one of the few children never scolded for squirming or fidgeting in church. She sat, her face arranged into a carefully blank expression, her eyes latched to the clock above the mantel, its hands ticking forward at a terrifyingly quick rate. No sooner had her family gathered in the parlor at 8:30 did the clock strike 10, then 11. And still, though Cook had spent every day after Christmas baking innumerable pies, tarts, preserves, and cakes, though the food barrels were stuffed to the brim, though Aggie was wearing her most fetching gown, no one came. So the paragraph above is a bit dense. You might call one of those sentences a little bit run-on, but I like it better than the opening paragraph in version 1 because it establishes Aggie's character, and it makes her stand out a bit rather than giving teeny tiny details of everybody. She stands out a bit, only child not squirming, carefully arranged face. You get a much better sense of her character. Her character has changed a lot since the first draft, by the way, in the description of her. It also sets up the main problem here, which is, no one's coming. To what? We don't know. Why? We don't know. But that's going to be the through line of this entire scene. Next to her on the settee, her sister Greer sat with horrific posture, reading a book with the intensity of a general at battle. It seemed terribly unfair that Greer, the cause of Aggie's present anguish, could be so oblivious to it. Aggie would have reached over and pinched her had Father not been seated on the armchair across from them. Without moving her head, Aggie saw that while the newspaper was open in front of him, Father, too, was watching the clock. So the opening is like a little bit slower, and it's a bit clunky in some places. In terms of purpose, though, we learn the following from that. 1, Greer is the reason that no one is at their house, and she is oddly oblivious to this. And 2, the father is upset about this. I don't like this transition very much. I fixed it later. It's okay. Finally, luncheon arrived, and Mother, Father, Greer, and Aggie settled in the bright dining room while the housemaid brought platter after platter from the kitchen. This has been an unexpectedly quiet morning, Aggie said. She eyed. Some of the above information is a bit repetitive, like the father is upset, so did we need the first description of him? Maybe not. But I like this because no one is coming right out and saying what's going on, and I feel like we're getting a bit of a better sense of the characters. Father was not one to worry about his friend snubbing him or one to think that a thing so small as a rumor could upset his life. He was a man, and one of Strachan's boys at that, which should have meant he was set for life, everything poised to move forwards in a way that benefited him. Women, of course, never had the luxury of assuming anything. I've narrowed the focus of this scene to look at the family and their positions. I like how in that above paragraph I introduced Strachan's boys, which is a tiny hint at some of the politics in the city. You also see that the tone of this is quite different than the tone of draft 1. Again, I end up somewhere between in the third draft, but we're not going to talk about that. Then we keep talking about food and the ball, and we have a little setup thing about the ball. The lines read kind of clunky to me. You can look at them yourself. And then Aggie says, "Are we still invited to the ball?" "Of course we are." Father's usually even voice had a degree of alarm to it. "The ball is for all of the government men and their families. And I am a member of the Legislative Assembly, am I not?" Again, Aggie looked at her sister. "Yes, of course. However," I feel like the exposition here could be a little bit more subtle, but I do like the uncertainty in their position, that even as we're explaining that the father is a part of a political official, even as that's being introduced, the fact that it could be taken away is kind of like, cool. I don't know. I like that part. "Nothing my daughters may have done changes my position." Father's tone was still calm, but Aggie wondered if he was truly as sure as he sounded. Not receiving visitors on New Year's Day was a greater snub than even she had predicted. They would have to move forward with exceptional care. Perhaps attending the governor's ball was a good decision. It wouldn't do to cower at home in shame. Then again, Aggie had to do everything possible to distance herself from her older sister. "Well, Greer isn't going to the ball then, surely." So we get Aggie's direct thoughts here, giving us some conflict between the sisters. They aren't flat out lying to each other or even speaking to each other yet, but there's some substance, there's some hints at the dynamics between the relationship. I think the hints at the dynamics between the relationships, maybe it's just that I knew that in the first draft there really wasn't anything behind it. Like I wasn't entirely sure what was going on. I kind of knew I wasn't. This one I'm like very, very certain, and I know what I'm moving towards. Right here, I want the reader to be asking a lot of questions, such as what happened? What did Greer do? Why is Greer totally unfazed by all of this? What's the deal with the father and the government stuff? And is Aggie being kind of malicious here? Like, what is going on? Again, Aggie looked at Greer, who was still not paying any attention. As Aggie watched, Brianna walked behind Greer, setting a cup down at her place. With a jump as if she'd been pinched, Greer looked up at the table. "Where? Going where?" "The governor's ball," Aggie sighed. "Father, it wouldn't be quite proper, would it?" Father hesitated, glancing back and forth between them. Greer cheerfully raised her teacup in a toast. "Absolutely not proper at all. I'll stay home then, shall I?" And Greer focused back down at her lap, shoving a scone into her mouth as she did so. So in this version, the ball plans go on for another 50 words. The father does leave, and then the tension between Greer and Aggie explodes in miniature. As the scene progresses, we gain a pretty clear picture of what actually happened to keep them from getting visitors, and at the end of this sequence, the final line, hopefully, changes completely everything the audience thought and assumed about the incident. I can't really show you that because I don't want to go into that many spoilers, but it's fun. Now, it's very difficult, I think, to judge whether one opening is better than another. Neither of them are perfect, and I do have some things that I kind of like about the first one that I don't think are necessarily coming across as well in the second one. But overall, in the second one, I'm on the path that I need to be for the novel. Those are the two versions of first drafts of my novel. I would love to hear your feedback. Did you like seeing one version and the other and hearing me talk about the differences between them? If you like this style of video, please definitely give it a big thumbs up so I know to make more of this style. I like doing this, although it's kind of nerve-wracking to put your own writing up, so Thank you so much for watching. Leave me a comment, let me know what you thought, and I will see you. For hours, Agatha Kent said, okay, with plant, without plant. It rolls. No, it's so much better with the plant, isn't it? This is also not my plant. I love it when you have housemates. Like, not my cat, not my plant. I don't even know whose coat rack this is. Okay, I should probably talk about writing now.